The setting sun bled gold and crimson across the lonely mountain highway, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts between the pines. Tires screeched, gravel scattered. The low growl of a German shepherd cut through the stillness, followed by cruel laughter. Scout, his tan fur matted with blood and dirt, stood surrounded, 5 bikers encircling him like vultures picking over the last scrap of prey. His flank trembled from a deep wound near the ribs, but his stance remained unbroken. One biker wielding a rusted chain swung low. Scout didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked beyond the gang, toward the brush, where Dan Whitaker crouched behind a fallen log, his pulse pounding like war drums in his ears. He couldn't wait much longer. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Dan's breath clouded in the cold air as he squinted through his rifle's scope. His finger hovered over the trigger, not for a clean kill, but for a clean message. He knew every heartbeat counted. The gang wasn't just playing around. This was an execution. Scout bared his teeth, letting out a low, guttural snarl that barely masked the pain behind it. His ears twitched. He had sensed Dan's presence. That silent connection, years forged in fire, blood, and bond, held strong even now. The biker with the chain stepped forward again, arrogance swelling in each stride. A tattoo coiled down his forearm, a black vulture wrapped around a dagger. Dan's stomach tightened. That insignia hadn't been seen since Columbia, since Cole. His grip on the trigger tightened. "Finish the mutt!" one of them yelled. Dan rose. "Step away from him," he said, his voice slicing the dusk air with calm authority. The gang turned. Silence. Scout's ears perked. His body tensed, not in fear, but recognition. With staggering determination, he limped toward the voice, toward Dan. The moment pulled tight like a drawn bowstring. The biker with the chain turned, cocked his head, and sneered. "Look who decided to show." Dan didn't blink. "That dog's worth more than all of you put together." A standoff. Scout collapsed beside Dan's boots, breathing shallow but eyes alert. The gang hesitated. Their leader, the one with the chain, took a step back. Dan didn't move, but his gaze spoke volumes. The balance shifted. "Let's go," one biker barked. "Not worth it." Boots shuffled. Gravel crunched. In under 30 seconds they were gone, vanishing into the thickening forest shadows, but not without shouting promises of revenge. Dan holstered his weapon and dropped to his knees beside Scout. He cradled the dog's head with both hands, brushing away the blood from his snout. "You held your ground, boy," he whispered, voice cracking. "You always do." Scout let out a faint whimper, leaning into Dan's touch. A glint caught Dan's eye, something metallic near the spot where the leader had stood. A small scuffed USB drive, barely visible in the dust. He scooped it up, flipping it between his fingers. Unlabeled. Unremarkable. Dangerous. Dan's gut clenched. They weren't after Scout. They were after this. And if they were willing to break the code of the forest, to hunt a retired agent and his canine partner, that meant someone powerful wanted it hidden. With one arm he lifted Scout and began the trek back to his truck, parked half a mile down the ridge. The sun had dipped below the horizon and the Oregon air turned sharp and unforgiving. Scout didn't make a sound, but his heartbeat, faint and steady, thudded against Dan's chest. By the time they reached the truck, Dan's shirt was soaked in sweat, his muscles burning. He eased Scout into the back seat, wrapping him in a worn flannel jacket. As the engine roared to life, headlights cutting through mist and pine, Dan gave one last look into the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty, but it didn't feel empty, not anymore. The neon open sign flickered weakly in the window of a modest roadside veterinary clinic nestled at the edge of Bend, Oregon's pine forest. The gravel crunched under Dan's boots as he carried Scout across the lot, cradled like a child in his arms. The dog's weight was solid, heavy, but familiar. The warmth of his body fading slowly beneath Dan's jacket made each step feel urgent. His heart thudded louder than his footsteps. He pushed through the door. The bell overhead chimed. A receptionist in scrubs looked up, startled. "Can I—" "Emergency," Dan cut in, voice low but strained. "Gunshot wound, canine." That was all it took. She reached for the wall-mounted phone. "Doctor. Rowe to trauma. Now." Less than a minute later, Dr. Emily Rowe burst through the swinging doors. Early 40s, tall, dark curls pulled into a messy bun, eyes sharp as scalpels. She froze when she saw Dan. "Dan Whitaker," she breathed, blinking. "No time for that," Dan replied. It's Scout." Her gaze dropped to the bundle in his arms. The moment she saw the blood seeping through the flannel, her demeanor shifted. "Bring him," she said, holding the door open. "Now." Dan followed her into the back, through a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and pinewood polish. She directed him to a stainless steel table beneath a bright halogen light. As Dan laid Scout down, the dog gave a weak whimper, but his eyes stayed on Dan's face. "It's okay," Dan whispered. "I'm here." Emily pulled on gloves and immediately began examining the wound. Gunshot, clean entry but no exit. No shattered bone. Probably lodged in soft tissue. Still dangerous. Dan's jaw clenched. "Can you get it out?" Emily shot him a look. "I'll do everything I can. He's strong." Dan stepped back, giving her room to work, but didn't leave. He pressed his back to the wall and watched as she worked with steady hands and silent precision. Scout didn't take his eyes off Dan, even as the anesthesia kicked in. That look, unflinching, trusting, hit Dan like a sledgehammer. In another life, years ago, that look had belonged to a 6-year-old boy. It had been a rainy evening in Maryland, 12 years back. Dan had just come off an overseas assignment. His wife Lila had begged him to retire. "For Toby," she'd said, voice trembling, "we need you home." But Dan hadn't listened, and then came the accident. A runaway truck on a residential street, a bent bicycle, a small pair of sneakers in the road. By the time he returned, everything was ashes. Dan hadn't cried then, not even at the funeral. He remembered standing over the casket, surrounded by a sea of umbrellas, numb as the rain fell. It took months before he accepted the dog. Scout had been a last-chance rescue from a failed K-9 program. Too aggressive, they said, too hard to bond. He'd been scheduled for euthanasia when Dan took him in, more out of pity than purpose. But Scout had refused to die. Instead, he chose Dan. And Dan, slowly, had begun to live again. "Dan?" Emily's voice pulled him back. She was removing her gloves, now stained red. "He's stable for now, bullets out, but he lost a lot of blood. I've got him on fluids and antibiotics." Dan stepped forward, looking down at Scout. The dog's breathing was slow but steady. His flank rose and fell under a clean white bandage. His eyes were closed now, but the tension in his frame had eased. "Will he make it?" Emily sighed. "He's got a fighting chance, but he needs rest. And he can't take another hit like that." Dan swallowed hard. Emily folded her arms. "You gonna tell me what happened?" Dan hesitated. Then slowly he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the USB drive. He turned it over in his hand before placing it on the counter. "They weren't trying to kill Scout," he said quietly. "They were trying to get this." Emily arched an eyebrow. "What's on it?" "I don't know yet," Dan admitted. "But the ones who came for it, they were organized, armed, not some random punks." "You think it's related to your old job?" Dan nodded. "Worse, I saw their mark, a vulture wrapped around a dagger." Emily paled. "You think it's them? The ones you told me about?" "Shadow vultures, yeah." Emily sat down on the stool beside the exam table, rubbing her temples. "Dan, you're not a field agent anymore. You promised you'd walk away from that life." "I did." "Then why are they after you?" Dan looked at Scout. Because I never stopped being their problem. Hours passed. Scout remained unconscious, hooked up to machines that beeped softly in the dim light of the clinic. Dan sat by his side the entire time, unmoving, the USB drive clutched in his palm. Emily brought him a blanket, coffee, and silence. They didn't speak again until nearly dawn. "He needs somewhere quiet to recover," she said. "No noise, no stress." Dan nodded. "I know just the place." "Dan." He looked up. "Don't get him killed," she said softly. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood, leaned down, and kissed Scout's head. "You hear that, buddy?" he whispered. "You're not done yet." Scout's ear twitched. A response. A promise. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten. Mist clung to the asphalt like breath to glass. Dan opened the truck door carefully and slid the stretcher in. Emily handed him a bag of medical supplies and extra bandages. "Change the dressing every 12 hours. Keep him warm. And call me if anything changes." Dan nodded. "Thanks, Em." She caught his wrist before he turned. "Be careful. You're not just carrying him." Dan gave a weak smile. "I know." As he pulled onto the road, the USB drive sat on the passenger seat, glinting faintly in the new light. He glanced at the rearview mirror. Scout lay still in the back, but Dan swore he saw one eye crack open. Just enough. The rain had begun again, soft at first, then steady, drumming gently on the roof of Dan Whitaker's pickup truck as he turned off the narrow service road and pulled into the tree-shrouded driveway of his safe house. The headlights cut through thick curtains of mist, revealing an old A-frame cabin nestled between towering Douglas firs, its windows dark and lifeless. No neighbors, no noise, just the sound of the forest breathing. Dan parked beneath the sloped overhang and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel with one hand and glancing into the rearview mirror. Scout lay curled on the mattress in the back seat, wrapped in a flannel blanket, an IV line still taped to his paw. He hadn't stirred in the last 2 hours, but his chest moved. That was enough for now. Dan opened the door, stepped into the mud, and inhaled the sharp, earthy air. He unlocked the front door quickly, checked all the window latches, and flipped the circuit breaker. Warm light flickered to life inside. Then he returned to the truck and with great care lifted Scout into his arms again. Inside the cabin, he set Scout down near the fireplace on a dog bed layered with towels and pillows. The room was modest, wood-paneled walls, a few framed photos, a stack of logs beside the hearth, but it was secure. Reinforced windows, hidden escape hatch, signal jamming perimeter. This was where Dan had disappeared after retirement, where no one could find him, until now. He lit the fire, boiled water for tea, then sat down at the scarred wooden table in the center of the room. In front of him, his old encrypted laptop, and next to it, the USB drive. For a while, he just stared at it. It looked so ordinary. Black plastic casing, scratched. No labels, no markings. But he knew. He knew that this was why those bikers came for Scout. Why they'd risked assaulting a former agent with combat experience and a K9. Why they'd used a gang insignia he hadn't seen in over a decade. This thing wasn't a mistake. It was a message. He inserted it into the port. The drive loaded instantly. A folder popped open on the screen. Inside were 3 items. 1. A heavily encrypted spreadsheet titled Manifest 7X, Cargo 2. A folder labeled Surveillance 3. A single PDF named Names. Dan's heart beat faster. He clicked on the surveillance folder first. Inside were dozens of image files, mostly grainy photos, date-stamped over the last several months. The locations made his stomach drop. Klamath Falls, Redmond, Bend, even a few shots taken outside this very cabin. But what chilled him to the core was the subject, himself. There he was, standing on his porch with Scout, walking through a grocery store parking lot, leaving the vet's office just weeks ago. And Scout was in nearly every frame. Dan sat back slowly, his throat dry. They've been watching us. He opened the PDF next. It was a list. Roughly 50 names organized by region and affiliation. Some were clearly code names, others full identities. But he recognized at least 4 of them. 2 were former military intelligence officers, 1 a private contractor with ties to Balkan arms deals, and the last, his stomach turned to stone. Cole Brenner. Rank. Classified status, presumed KIA, 2017. Affiliation, unknown. Last activity, Oregon, flagged. Dan pushed the laptop away as if the screen had suddenly burned him. Cole. He'd served with Cole for 4 years. They'd been inseparable during their last tour, running deep cover operations in South America. Cole had been loyal, brilliant, reckless, but effective. And then he vanished during a mission in Medellin. The op went sideways, 2 agents died, and Cole was never seen again. The official story was that he'd been captured and killed. But Dan never believed it, and now, his name appeared in a folder with surveillance of Dan and Scout. He opened the final file, Manifest 7X Cargo. It took a minute to decrypt, then, line by line, the contents loaded. Shipment numbers, coordinates, drop dates, descriptions in vague terms, merchandise, cold units, secured specimens. The spreadsheet tracked logistics, but not for weapons, for people. Dan stared in disbelief. He clicked through several tabs. Each one was a different route, crossing into rural counties where law enforcement oversight was scarce. Some were flagged as temporary storage, with coordinates that linked to old ranger stations and off-grid compounds. He rubbed his forehead. Trafficking. It's human trafficking. The bikers weren't just a gang. They were logistics, the delivery muscle. And the shadow vultures, they weren't just some outlaw club. They were a moving piece in a multi-state black market operation. Scout had nearly died for this. Dan stood abruptly, pushing back from the table. He paced the room, fists clenched. If Cole was alive, and part of this, there were only 2 explanations. Either he'd turned, or he'd gone deep, really deep, and if it was the second, then maybe he'd left this USB drive behind on purpose. Dan stopped pacing, looked over at Scout. The dog was still lying on his side, but one ear had perked. His eyes blinked slowly, aware, if distant. Dan crossed the room, knelt beside him, and rested a hand gently on his neck. They were coming for the drive, he said softly, but they didn't expect you. Scout didn't move, but his gaze met Dan's for a long moment. You bought us time, Dan whispered. A gust of wind slammed into the cabin, rattling the windows. Dan's instincts fired. He moved quickly to check the locks again, adjusting the curtain at the front window. His eyes scanned the woods. Nothing but trees and rain. Still, his gut stirred. He turned back to the table, picked up the drive, and slid it into a reinforced pouch under the floorboards. Then he grabbed his satellite phone and pulled up his old contacts. Most were cold, but one number, encrypted under the name Sawyer M., was still active. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the call button. Then Scout let out a low, warning growl. Dan froze. A light, small, faint, flickered behind the trees in the distance, then vanished. His pulse kicked up. Someone's here, he muttered, more to Scout than to himself. He reached for his weapon, checking the chamber. His eyes never left the window. Scout was already trying to rise. No, no, stay, Dan whispered urgently. You've done enough. But Scout wouldn't lie still. He pushed himself onto shaky legs, growling low again. Dan grabbed his gear and scanned the window once more. Whoever had the drive before him had drawn blood to protect it. Whoever wanted it back was getting desperate. Dan narrowed his eyes. Let them come. The forest didn't sleep at night. It whispered. Branches creaked under the weight of damp air. Leaves rustled in patterns only animals could understand. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then went silent. Dan sat at the kitchen table of the cabin, his Glock stripped and laid out before him, each component lined up with mechanical precision. Cleaning his weapon always centered him. But tonight, even routine failed to quiet the noise in his head. He kept glancing toward the front window. The flicker of light he'd seen earlier hadn't returned, but the feeling hadn't left. That subtle wrongness, the kind he'd learned to trust more than intel, like the forest was holding its breath. Scout lay beside the fireplace, half wrapped in a flannel blanket, bandaged and still recovering. The meds were working, but he was restless. Every now and then his ears twitched at sounds Dan couldn't hear. He wouldn't bark, not yet, but the growls that rumbled low in his chest were enough. Dan reassembled the Glock without looking, his hands moving from muscle memory. Then he stood and walked to the wall, opening a hidden panel behind a bookshelf. Inside, a small arsenal. 2 more pistols, a bolt-action rifle, a tactical shotgun, and a black duffel bag marked Whittaker DD. He grabbed the shotgun and set it by the door. He didn't know if they were coming tonight, but when they did, they'd find the place ready. By midnight, the rain had stopped. The forest was thick with fog, hanging low like smoke. Dan sat near Scout, his back against the stone hearth, a wool blanket draped across his shoulders. He couldn't sleep. Not while that USB drive sat under his floorboards like a lit fuse. He looked at Scout, whose breathing had slowed but was far from steady. The dog opened one eye at Dan's movement. "You're stubborn," Dan whispered. "You know that?" Scout's eye closed again, but his tail thumped once. Dan leaned back and stared at the ceiling, pine beams, old and cracked. He had built this cabin after he left the bureau, hammered every nail himself. He'd told people he needed a place to disappear. The truth? He needed somewhere the memories couldn't reach him. Didn't work. They followed anyway. He thought about Lila, about Toby. He hadn't spoken their names in years. Scout had never met them. And yet somehow, Dan had let this dog into a part of himself that had long been boarded up. Maybe that's why tonight felt different. Maybe that's why it hurt more. Dan stood and walked back to the table, opened his laptop again. The screen bathed the room in pale light. The USB files still haunted him. The surveillance, the cargo manifests, the name Cole Brenner. If Cole had really turned, it would explain everything. The betrayal, the coordination, the precision. But if he hadn't... Dan clicked into a subfolder he hadn't touched earlier. Personal logs. Inside were 3 audio files, each labeled with a single date. He clicked the earliest one. A man's voice, gravelly, uncertain, crackled through the speakers. "If you're hearing this, then I didn't make it out. My name's Cole Brenner. I was embedded with the shadow vultures for 8 months before they turned on me. I have reason to believe we were never independent. We're being funded, directed by something bigger, private interests, political ties, maybe even domestic." Dan froze. "I left the USB with the one person who might still do the right thing. Dan, if it's you..." "I'm sorry for Medellin. You were right, and you were always better than me." The recording clicked off. Dan stared at the laptop, his pulse loud in his ears. Cole wasn't rogue. He was deep cover, and now he was either dead or being hunted by the same people hunting Dan. Scout stirred by the fire, let out a soft, high-pitched whine. Dan stood slowly, walked over. Kneeling, he scratched behind Scout's ears. The dog leaned into the touch as if grounding himself. "I think we're in this together again," Dan whispered. "Old ghosts. Same war." Scout's ears twitched. Then he growled, deep and certain. Dan shot up. Outside, a twig snapped, not the kind a deer made, too deliberate, too slow. He moved without hesitation, lights off, weapon in hand. He pressed his back against the wall beside the window and waited. Another step. then silence. Dan moved to the back door, slipping it open just wide enough to see. Fog still blanketed the woods, but shapes danced at the edges, figures moving between trees. At least 3, maybe more. He closed the door silently and returned to Scout. "Time to move," he said. Scout tried to rise, his legs trembled. Dan didn't wait. He grabbed the emergency sling and carefully secured it around Scout's body, then hoisted the weight onto his shoulders. "You saved me once," he muttered. "Let me return the favor." He opened the floor hatch, beneath the rug near the table, and climbed down into the tunnel. Reinforced, narrow, and dark. He closed the hatch behind them, sealing it with a quiet click. Above, the floorboards creaked. They were inside. Dan switched on his penlight and moved through the tunnel, each step echoing into the dirt walls. Scout didn't make a sound. They were both used to silence. The tunnel stretched a quarter-mile underground, ending at a disguised trapdoor behind a boulder deep in the forest. As Dan neared the exit, he paused. Above, wind rustled the trees. No footsteps, no voices. Still, he waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then, carefully, he lifted the hatch and scanned the woods. Clear. He emerged into the darkness, Scout still over his shoulders, and slipped into the trees without a sound. Behind them, the cabin burned. The orange glow lit the fog like a ghost. The forest glowed behind them like an open wound. Dan didn't look back. The orange flicker of his cabin in flames cast long shadows that danced between the trees, but he kept moving. Steady, focused, carrying Scout through underbrush that clawed at his legs. Each footstep was deliberate, honed by years of training that no retirement could dull. His breath came in tight, shallow bursts, but he ignored the fatigue. Scout's weight dragged on his shoulders, but Dan barely noticed. The dog didn't whimper, didn't twitch. His body, though still alive, had gone eerily still. "Hang in there," Dan muttered. "We've made it through worse." He followed an old deer trail leading away from the cabin and deeper into the national forest. Years ago, he'd memorized every bend in the land, every dip and ridge between the trees. The route would take them to an abandoned fire lookout tower about 2 miles out. It wasn't much, but it was elevation, visibility, and distance. All they needed right now. Halfway there, he stopped behind a thick stand of firs. He knelt, easing Scout down gently into the moss. The dog's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in hours, he let out a small huff of breath. "You're awake," Dan whispered. "Good." Scout blinked once, slow and deliberate. Dan checked the bandage on his side, still intact but damp with sweat and blood. He'd have to clean it again soon. The medbag Emily had packed was slung over his shoulder, but supplies were limited. He couldn't risk infection. The first distant sound of engines reached his ears, low, muffled, approaching. They weren't done. Dan pulled out his binoculars and scanned the slope behind them. Through a break in the trees, he saw silhouettes moving between shadows, flashlights cutting beams through the smoke. 4 figures at least, maybe more, spread wide, coordinated. "They want the drive," Dan murmured, "and they know I still have it." Scout let out a low growl, even as his head remained down. Dan gave a grim smile. "Yeah, I'm not giving it up either." He grabbed a handful of pine needles, rubbed them between his palms, and smeared the scent onto Scout's coat. Then he did the same to himself. It wasn't perfect, but it had masked their trail for a few yards. Just enough. The engines cut out. Silence returned. Dan slung Scout back over his shoulders and started moving again, this time taking a narrow game trail that twisted down a shallow ravine. His boots slid on the wet slope, but he kept upright, letting instinct guide him. He made it to the base of the lookout tower just as the wind began to pick up, scattering the fog. The tower loomed above him, 30 feet of old, creaking wood, abandoned, since the late 90s, but still standing. He ascended the ladder one careful rung at a time, cradling Scout as best he could, ignoring the scream of his thighs and the fire in his lungs. At the top he kicked open the trapdoor and hauled them both inside. The air smelled like dust and old timber. A metal cot rusted in one corner, and maps curled on the wall from years of neglect. Dan set Scout down, wrapped him in a wool blanket he found in a cabinet, and then turned to face the dark forest below. He watched for lights, for movement, for anything, and then he saw it. One of the bikers moved into a clearing about 50 yards from the base of the tower. He wasn't searching. He was speaking into a radio, his voice low and urgent. Dan raised the rifle he'd brought up with him and peered through the scope. The man turned just slightly. Dan's finger froze on the trigger. The side of the man's neck bore a tattoo, a black vulture, talons dripping red. Dan's blood turned to ice. That wasn't just the symbol of the gang. That was Cole's unit insignia. He hadn't seen it since Medellin. Since the day Cole went dark and 2 good agents died. Dan lowered the rifle, his mind racing. Had Cole sent that man? Was he still alive? And if so, was he part of this, or trying to stop it? Scout shifted slightly behind him. Dan turned, saw the dog watching him, not just weakly, but with focus. Sharp, aware. "You saw it too, didn't you?" Dan said softly. "That mark." Scout thumped his tail once against the floorboards. Dan turned back to the window, jaw clenched. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a gang trying to recover a drive. This was connected to the operation that had nearly destroyed Cole. That had almost destroyed him. And now the pieces were falling back into place, too neatly, too quickly. He needed answers. And for that, he needed to move before they boxed him in. He slid the rifle back into its case and resecured the drive beneath his shirt. Then he knelt beside Scout, brushing his hand through the thick fur at his neck. "I need you to hold on a little longer, partner," he whispered. Scout lifted his head and touched his nose to Dan's hand. It wasn't just obedience, it was understanding. Dan slung the pack over his shoulder again, then grabbed the flare gun mounted to the wall. If he could get to the ranger station northeast of the peak, there'd be a working landline, emergency only, but secure. The plan was clear now. Get out. Get up. Get to the truth. He opened the trapdoor again and looked down into the fog. The flames of his cabin had burned out behind them, but the fire chasing them hadn't. Not yet. The first light of dawn filtered weakly through the canopy, painting the forest floor in muted grays and golds. Dan moved like a shadow through the pines, Scout pressed close to his side. The dog's gait was uneven, one leg still stiff from the wound. But he refused to stop, not even when Dan tried to carry him again. They were 3 miles from the lookout tower now, cutting northwest toward an abandoned ranger station Dan had once used as a field post during an anti-poaching task force deployment. It wasn't on most maps. That was why it might still be safe. But the woods felt different now, less like shelter and more like a trap waiting to close. Every snapped twig made Dan's pulse spike. Every echo in the mist raised questions. He hadn't seen the bikers since nightfall, but he didn't need to. They were out there. They were hunting him. And the drive. But the longer they stayed hidden, the more Dan worried they weren't just chasing. They were circling. An hour later, Dan paused at a shallow creek, letting Scout rest in the ferns while he refilled the canteen. The dog slumped into the soft earth, his chest rising and falling heavily, ears barely twitching at the sound of water. Dan knelt beside him and unwrapped the bandage. The wound was still sealed, but the swelling had grown. Red streaks had started to appear along Scout's ribs. Infection. Dan's chest tightened. They had to reach the station by nightfall, no matter what. He reached into his pack and pulled out a clean syringe of antibiotics, one of the last. Scout didn't flinch as the needle went in. He just leaned gently into Dan's knee, pressing the side of his face against him. It reminded Dan of the first time they met. He hadn't wanted a dog, not after the funeral, not after the guilt hollowed out everything inside him. But the bureau psychologist wouldn't clear him for field work unless he passed 6 weeks of psychological rehab. One part of that, companion animal therapy. At first, Dan had been assigned a retired search and rescue golden retriever named Marley. Sweet, quiet, and entirely uninterested in him. It didn't work. Nothing did. Then one day they brought in a German shepherd with a bite record and trust issues. The kennel worker said, "We're giving him 1 more week before permanent transfer." Dan remembered locking eyes with the dog through the cage bars. There wasn't rage in the animal's gaze. There was grief. A reflection of something raw and wounded, something familiar. The dog didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just sat. And Dan sat with him. For hours. He didn't speak. Didn't reach through the bars. He just was there. And the dog stayed. 3 days later, Scout followed him home. No leash, no command. He just chose him. Now that same dog was laying in the forest, trying to stay upright despite a fever. Dan knelt beside him again and whispered, "You don't have to prove anything. You already saved me. Remember?" Scout opened his eyes and let out a slow, tired huff. Dan pulled him close for a moment, then stood and scanned the ridgeline. The station was about a mile away. Uphill. Through dense pine and rock. If they could make it there, he could stabilize Scout, find supplies, maybe make contact with someone. Anyone he still trusted. He adjusted the strap on his backpack and hoisted Scout into a field sling, tightening it across his chest. "Let's finish this part," he muttered, starting the climb. It took the better part of 2 hours to reach the clearing. By then the sun was high overhead, but the cold still clung to the soil. The ranger station looked even more run down than he remembered. Roof partially caved in, siding warped with age. But the outer frame held. Most importantly, no fresh tire tracks, no footprints. Dan set Scout down inside on a faded wool cot in the corner. The floor creaked but held. He checked the first aid cabinet, empty. Rummaged through drawers, found gauze, a rusted flashlight, and a half-used bottle of iodine. It would have to do. He knelt beside Scout, cleaned the wound, and rewrapped it as gently as he could. The dog winced but didn't move. His trust was absolute, even now. Dan finished bandaging and sat back against the wall, exhausted. The weight of it all pressed on his chest. The data, the memories, the flames, and now this damn infection eating at the only living thing he had left. Scout turned his head slightly, eyes open again. Dan reached out and stroked between his ears. "I lost my family once," he whispered. "I don't plan on doing it again." A soft rustle outside made him freeze. Dan was on his feet in an instant, gun drawn. A silhouette moved past the window, then another. Not boots, not bikers. Patterned movement. Clean. Quiet. Dan's blood went cold. They weren't just bikers anymore. They were trained. Whoever had taken over the pursuit. They weren't playing around. Dan backed toward Scout, checked the rifle, and secured the USB drive into the interior pouch of his jacket. Then he leaned down and whispered into the dog's ear, "No matter what happens, you stay down. You hear me? Just stay down." Scout gave a soft exhale in reply. Dan turned toward the window, weapon ready, heart pounding. Outside, the forest had gone silent again. But the war was just beginning. Dan crouched by the boarded-up window of the ranger station, his breath shallow and controlled, finger resting on the trigger of his sidearm. Outside, the forest had slipped into a dangerous kind of stillness, the kind that comes when predators close in. Then, footsteps, deliberate, padded, no rush, no panic. Dan raised his gun, leveling it at the front entrance as a silhouette came into view through the warped glass of the door. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black tactical gear, not biker leather. The figure carried no visible weapon. Dan's finger tightened. The man raised both hands slowly, his voice calm. "Dan Whitaker, I'm not here to fight. Dan froze. That voice. It shouldn't have existed anymore. He stepped around the corner, still keeping the gun trained. The stranger remained still, hands high, not making a move. Dan took a few steps forward until the face was fully visible through the glass. A little older, a little more worn, but unmistakable. Cole Brenner, alive. Dan didn't lower the weapon. You're supposed to be dead. I know. Dan stepped closer, slowly opening the door with his foot, keeping his gun locked on Cole's chest. You vanished in Medellin, he said, voice low. 2 agents died. I covered their bodies with my own hands. What happened to you? Cole exhaled. I went under. Without telling anyone? I was told not to. Orders came from upstairs. Deepest op I've ever run, and it stayed deep until it all started falling apart. Dan gestured with his weapon. Inside, slowly. Cole stepped in, hands still raised. He scanned the space, his eyes catching on Scout lying on the cot in the corner. His expression changed, subtle, but there. Not surprise. Recognition. Dan circled him like a predator. Why are you here? To help you. I don't believe you. I wouldn't either. Dan stared him down. Start talking. Cole finally lowered his hands, slowly. The Vultures, at least the version you ran into, they're not just a gang anymore. They're contractors. Logistics for something a lot uglier. Smuggling, trafficking, weapons, people, intel. I figured as much, Dan muttered. They got too big, too fast, Cole continued. They had help. Someone wanted to keep the heat off. So I went in to trace the funding, find the route. And the USB? Dan asked. I stole it. Pulled it from a secured drop before they knew I was onto them. I was going to extract, but then they found out. I barely escaped. So I dropped the drive where I knew someone might find it, someone I trusted. Dan narrowed his eyes. You left it for me. Cole nodded. You let them attack my home. You let them nearly kill Scout. I didn't let anything happen, Cole said, jaw tightening. The drop was meant to be clean. I didn't know they'd follow it that fast. Dan stepped in closer, voice like ice. You disappeared for 6 years and came back with excuses. That doesn't make you my ally. No, Cole said calmly. But it doesn't make me your enemy either. Silence stretched. The fire crackled low in the wood stove. Scout shifted on the cot, letting out a low groan. Dan's eyes flicked to the dog. He walked over, placed a gentle hand on his neck. Scout opened one eye, and though his body trembled with weakness, his gaze moved to Cole. No growl, no tension, just watchfulness. Dan took a slow breath, processing. Scout's instincts had never failed him, not once. Dan looked back at Cole. You said they're after the drive because of what's on it, but that's only part of it, isn't it? Cole nodded. They think I told someone else. They don't know who. But you're not just a problem. You're leverage. If they catch you, they'll assume you know everything. And do I? Cole hesitated. You know enough, he said quietly. Enough to make them burn everything down. Dan turned, walked to the table, and opened the drawer where he had stashed his encrypted laptop. He plugged in the USB drive. Cole moved cautiously behind him, watching the screen. Dan clicked into the files. Cargo manifests, coordinates, drop points, then the list of names. I recognize some of them, Dan said, including yours. They kept tabs on me, Cole said, in case I flipped. They always knew I was a risk. Dan pulled up a document labeled Blackbirds_C7. Lines of financial transactions. Large sums transferred between shadow corporations, filtered through charities and logistics companies. Cole pointed to a name buried in the metadata. That one, Redland Global. It's the link. What is it? Front company, Cole said. Used to launder payments for high-risk extractions. Their signature shows up on contracts across multiple regions. Dan sat back. And who runs it? Cole's eyes met his. That's what I'm trying to find out. But whoever it is, they're untouchable unless someone makes the whole operation public. Dan looked back at Scout. The dog was watching him, quietly. His breath raspy, but even. Dan turned to Cole. You have 5 minutes to convince me you're worth trusting. Cole nodded slowly. Then let me show you something. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope, handed it over. Dan opened it cautiously. Inside, a photo. Grainy surveillance. A man in a black suit shaking hands with someone in biker colors. On the back scrawled in pencil, your op, your sacrifice, his payout. The man in the suit was a former bureau director, someone Dan once called a mentor. The betrayal hit hard. He closed the file, tucked it into his pocket. All right, Dan said quietly. You've got 5 minutes. Cole nodded. That's all I need. Behind them, Scout let out a long breath and closed his eyes again. Outside, the wind shifted. The woods were no longer silent. They were listening. The old ranger station creaked with the weight of silence. Outside, pine needles stirred in the wind, brushing softly against broken glass and rotting shingles. Inside, Dan stared at the photo in his hand. The former bureau director, shaking hands with the biker patched with the black vulture. His fingers gripped the edges tighter. You understand what this means, right? Cole asked, voice low, steady. Dan nodded slowly. It means everything we gave up, everything we lost. It was never about the mission. It was about profit. Redland Global funded 6 ops during our last year overseas, Cole continued. We thought it was federal backing, but it wasn't. It was them. And now they're cleaning house. Exactly. Dan looked over his shoulder. Scout lay on the cot in the corner, chest rising and falling with quiet effort. Emily's antibiotics were helping, but barely. He didn't have time to sit here and analyze every layer of corruption. He needed a way out. Cole was already moving, pulling a folded map from his coat pocket and laying it across the table. We're here, he said, pointing to the ranger station's location. There's a comms relay outpost tucked 6 miles northwest. Used to be part of a fire line network. Still operational if we can power it up. Dan studied it. You sure? Cole met his eyes. It's how I stayed ahead of them, this long. Dan looked down again. The map led through rough terrain, steep elevation, narrow ravines, no cover in some sections. But it was better than waiting for the vultures to find them. He folded the map. We'll move before sunrise. Cole nodded, then turned to check the door. That's when it happened. A loud crack split the silence. Wood splintering, followed by a flash of movement at the rear window. Dan spun just in time to see a shape drop in from the roof, boots slamming against the floorboards. Gunfire erupted. Dan dove sideways, tackling Cole to the ground behind the table as a burst of automatic rounds tore through the far wall. Plaster and wood exploded around them. Back door! Dan yelled. Cole grabbed the rifle stashed behind the crate and laid down covering fire. The attacker in the room ducked for cover, but more boots slammed outside, circling. They weren't dealing with gang muscle anymore. These men moved like professionals. Dan dashed to Scout, grabbing the sling and securing it around his torso as gently as he could. I've got him, he shouted to Cole. Bullets chewed through the doorframe as Cole dropped the nearest shooter with a precise shot, then grabbed the map and the gear bag. This way! They bolted through the back, smashing through rotted timber and sprinting into the trees. Scout across Dan's shoulders like dead weight. But the dog's breathing, though shallow, remained steady. Gunshots rang out behind them, echoing through the trees. One bullet grazed Dan's arm, just a line of fire across the skin, but it reminded him how close this had gotten. They ran for 20 minutes without slowing. Finally, in the shelter of a dry creek bed, they ducked behind a fallen tree. Dan dropped to one knee, catching his breath. glancing down at Scout. Still alive. Still fighting. He turned to Cole. That wasn't a random hit. They knew exactly where we were. Cole nodded grimly. We've been compromised. Dan scanned the forest, breath fogging in the air. They had gear, formation, coordination. These aren't bikers. They're contractors, Cole replied. Redland's private team. Hired to wipe anything connected to the USB, Dan pressed a blood-soaked bandage to his arm. How long before they realized we went north? Not long. Dan checked his watch, then looked at the slope ahead. Then we get to that relay before they cut us off. By the time they reached the foot of the ridge, the sun had begun to rise. Dim light washing the treetops in pale orange. The old fire relay tower stood half collapsed at the summit, its rusted steel frame twisted but still holding. They climbed fast, Dan gritting his teeth against the pain in his arm. Scout bundled carefully in his sling. Every 30 seconds he checked the dog's pulse, every beat giving him another reason to push forward. Inside the tower's small control shack, dust coated every surface. But the radio terminal sat where Cole remembered, tucked beneath a broken shelf. It'll need external power, Cole said. There's a solar battery on the roof. Dan set Scout down gently in the corner, wrapping him in a blanket from the pack. He looked paler now, his breathing more strained. Go, Dan said. I'll cover you. Cole nodded and scaled the ladder to the roof, reconnecting the loose wiring with practice speed. A faint hum filled the room as the radio flickered to life. Dan leaned over the mic. This is Whitaker, former federal field agent, emergency broadcast on Channel 47 Echo. If anyone hears this, I have data connected to Redland Global and human trafficking ops in Oregon. Repeat, this is Whitaker. We have the evidence and are under assault. Static. Then, a burst of garbled voices. Repeat. Say again, Whitaker. Dan pressed the button again, adrenaline spiking. We need extraction. Coordinates uploading now. Cole uploaded their GPS ping through the interface, rerouted through 2 encrypted nodes. As the signal stabilized, Scout let out a weak bark. Dan turned and froze. The dog was struggling to rise, tail twitching, his eyes locked on the door. Then came the crunch of boots on gravel. Dan lifted his rifle and moved to the window. One man, stepping out of the trees, not shooting, hands raised. Dan aimed through the scope. His heart stuttered. It wasn't a soldier. It was the biker from the surveillance photo, the one with the patch, the one Dan thought he'd kill the moment he saw him again. But now he walked forward, hands still high. No gun, he called out. Not here to fight. Dan's finger hovered on the trigger. Then what the hell are you here for? To tell you something, the man said. I used to run with the vultures. Until I heard what they were really moving, what they were doing. Dan didn't lower his weapon. I saw what they did to the girl, the man continued. She couldn't have been more than 10. Dan blinked. The man's voice cracked. I didn't sign up for that. I've got a daughter. I tried to walk away. They burned my trailer, killed my brother. I got nothing left. But I know where they're going next. Dan looked at Cole, who was already stepping toward the door. If he's telling the truth, Cole said, he might be the last person alive who knows where the bodies are buried. Dan hesitated, then lowered the rifle. The ranger turned informant's name was Travis Hale, a man in his late 40s with sun-scorched skin, a stitched-up jaw, and eyes that had seen more than they wanted to. He sat by the flickering lantern light inside the relay station, flanked by Dan and Cole, his hands shaking not from fear but exhaustion. Scout lay nearby, resting, his shallow breathing the only sound besides the soft hum of the powered radio. Cole poured black coffee into a chipped tin mug and handed it over. Start talking. Travis nodded and took a long sip, then looked at Dan. You want to know what they're moving. It's not just kids, it's not just women, it's people with uses. Dan's jaw flexed. Uses? Doctors who disappeared, engineers, former intelligence officers gone off-grid. Some were bribed, some were taken. Redland isn't trafficking to sell. They're building something. Dan and Cole exchanged a look. Travis continued, pulling a folded map from the inside of his jacket. I stole this the day I ran. Took it from a drop vehicle near the Idaho line. They're expanding east. Oregon was just a dry run. He spread the map on the floor. Red circles marked rural locations, abandoned ranger posts, off-the-grid cabins, long-shuttered fire camps. In total, 15 sites across Oregon, Idaho, and parts of Montana, each marked cleared. What do those mean? Cole asked. Travis hesitated. Cleared means processed. One site for holding, one for transport, one for disposal. Dan's stomach twisted. Disposal? They don't keep loose ends, Travis said quietly. People who won't cooperate vanish. Anyone who saw too much disappears with them. My brother found one of the disposal sites, and he paid for it. Dan stared at the map, then down at Scout. His loyal partner nearly killed over this. They had to end it. Redland's headquarters? He asked. Where? Travis shook his head. No one knows the real headquarters, but I can get you to their next move. He pointed at a mark near the border of eastern Oregon and Nevada. Site 12. They're prepping a major transport from there tomorrow night. Biggest one yet. 6 vehicles. 14 people. Kids. Dan felt his fists clench. Cole spoke first. How many on site? 8 men. 2 drones. A comms unit. Maybe a portable jammer. Dan stood, pacing now. We'll need to intercept the transport, free the captives, and copy their comm logs. Cole looked at him. You thinking extraction or shutdown? Dan's eyes were cold. Both. Scout stirred in the corner, letting out a low whine. Dan knelt beside him and laid a hand on his head. We take them down, he whispered. No more running. We burn this thing out at the root. Cole nodded. Then we hit Site 12 at dusk tomorrow. I know a canyon path we can use for cover. Dan turned to Travis. You coming? Travis swallowed hard. You got a weapon? Dan tossed him a sidearm. You've seen what they do. You know what's coming. You in? Travis looked at the gun in his hand, then at Scout. Yeah, he said. I'm in. The next few hours passed in preparation. Dan cleaned weapons, reviewed site schematics from stolen data, and memorized the terrain around Site 12. Cole calibrated drone signal blockers, using parts scavenged from the radio tower. Travis checked and rechecked the map. Scout remained weak, but alert. Dan stayed close, feeding him water by hand, whispering quiet reassurances. You brought me back once, Dan told him. Now it's my turn. Just before nightfall, Dan stepped outside for air. The wind had picked up, brushing through the trees in gusts. For a moment he let himself listen to the rustle of pine, the hum of distant thunder. Then a soft voice behind him. You ever think we'd end up back here? Cole asked, stepping beside him. Dan didn't answer right away. Number. But I always knew we weren't done. Cole looked out at the horizon. You were right back then in Medellin. I should have pulled the plug when the op got dirty. You were trying to finish the mission. I was trying to prove something. Dan turned toward him. Tomorrow isn't about proving anything. It's about finishing what someone else tried to bury. Cole nodded. Then let's bury them instead. Later that night, Dan sat beside Scout again, flashlight casting long shadows along the wood-paneled walls. He traced the scars on the dog's side, battle-worn marks that spoke louder than any metal. He remembered that first mission they ran together. In a collapsed building outside Basra, Scout had sniffed out 3 trapped hostages under rubble, ignoring flames and broken glass. He hadn't hesitated, hadn't needed orders. He had simply chosen to save. You're still that dog, Dan whispered, "and I'm still the man who needed saving." Scout blinked once, a soft huff of breath. The trust was still there, even in pain, even in near darkness. Dan leaned in, forehead against Scout's, eyes closed. "We go together," he said. "Always." Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and rain, but beneath it was something else. Movement, a shift in the air, the calm before the storm. The desert air had a stillness to it, one that came just before something broke. Dusk settled across the canyon, painting the rocks in shades of red and ash. Dan, Cole, and Travis crouched behind a ledge overlooking Site 12, a makeshift transport hub hidden between two jagged ridges at the edge of the Oregon-Nevada border. Portable floodlights cast harsh circles of white onto cargo containers. ATV tracks crisscrossing the dirt. Armed guards moved in quiet formation, radios clipped to vests. They weren't amateurs. Dan studied them through binoculars, memorizing their patterns. 4 at the perimeter, 2 at the comms truck, another 2 watching the prisoners. He could see them. 14 people inside a chain-linked pen near the far trailer. Women, men. 2 children huddled in the corner. Muffled crying floated faintly on the wind. "We hit hard and fast," Cole said. "I'll take the left flank. You and Travis breach the gates. We pull the captives out first." Dan looked back at Scout, who lay in a shaded nook beneath a tarp, shielded from the wind. He was breathing more easily now, thanks to a final dose of painkillers and fluids. Weak, but alert. His eyes tracked every word spoken. Dan knelt beside him and clipped a small transponder to the dog's collar. "Just in case we're separated." Scout blinked slowly. "I'm leaving the fight to us," Dan whispered. "You've done enough." He turned to join Cole and Travis. The final assault would begin in 60 seconds. When the smoke grenades went off, the desert exploded into chaos. Dan moved with precision, his steps silent in the gravel as he cut through the wire fence using bolt cutters. Travis covered him, keeping the guards at the western end pinned with short bursts of suppressive fire. Cole's side was louder. An explosive charge took out one ATV and sent 2 mercenaries diving for cover. Dan reached the cage. A guard spotted him and raised his weapon, but Dan dropped him, with 1 shot to the shoulder and another to the knee. He kicked open the gate. "We're getting you out of here," he told the captives. "Stay low. Move fast. Go!" The group scattered, crawling through the broken fence into the dry brush where Travis waited to lead them back to the extraction ridge. But it didn't stay smooth. A second team emerged from behind a transport truck. Reinforcements, better armed, moving in tight formation. Dan dropped to one knee, returning fire, covering the last of the civilians as they escaped. Then a sharp sound behind him, a low guttural growl. Scout. Dan whipped around. The dog was running, not limping, not staggering, running toward him. "Scout, no, stay down." But the dog ignored him. Instinct took over. A guard behind Dan had raised a rifle, one Dan hadn't seen. Scout lunged, teeth sinking into the man's forearm, driving him backward with the full weight of his body. The man screamed and dropped the weapon. Dan turned and finished the job with a clean shot. Then everything froze. Scout collapsed. Not from recoil, not from pain, but from the blood now soaking into the dirt beneath him. Dan ran to him, dropped to his knees, pulled him close. "No, no, no, Scout!" The dog's eyes fluttered. He was alive, but barely. Dan pressed his hands to the wound. "Stay with me. You don't leave me now." Cole appeared beside him, rifle raised. "We've got movement coming in from the ridge. Vehicles. 2, maybe 3. "We have to move," Dan said, voice trembling. Travis returned, breathless. "The captives are clear. We just need to extract." Cole's gaze shifted to Scout. "Can you carry him?" Dan didn't answer. He lifted Scout into his arms. The dog was heavier now, not just with weight, but with everything he meant. Every mission, every moment, every piece of Dan's life that still felt human. They moved together across the open field toward the escape route. Bullets whizzed past them, dirt exploding in bursts. Cole and Travis provided cover, their shots clean and efficient. One vehicle exploded in the distance, a fuel tank hit by a well-placed round. By the time they reached the rocks, Dan was soaked in blood, Scout's and his own. But he didn't stop. They made it to the ridge where the satellite relay pulsed a faint blue. Dan collapsed behind a rock outcrop, laying Scout gently on a sleeping bag. The dog whimpered once, then licked Dan's hand. "Good boy," Dan whispered, his voice cracking. A helicopter's blades roared overhead, searchlights scanning, then focusing on their position. Cole fired a flare, a signal, extraction. Within minutes, a medevac team descended. The captives were ushered in first, then Travis, then Cole. Dan stayed with Scout. "You're going with me," he said, gripping his collar. "I don't care what they say. You're getting on that bird." One of the medics stepped forward. "Sir, we don't usually transport animals, but—" Dan cut him off. "He's not an animal. He's my partner." They made space. Dan lifted Scout into the chopper and climbed in after him. As they lifted off, he looked down at Site 12, now burning, collapsing into itself. A black vulture flag torn and flapping in the flames. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time, it was turning. The fluorescent lights of the emergency veterinary hospital were too bright, too clean, too disconnected from the dirt and fire of the desert they'd just left behind. Dan sat on a steel bench in a sterile hallway, blood dried on his shirt, the smell of gunpowder still clinging to his skin. His hands shook, not from adrenaline, but from something far colder. They'd rushed Scout through the double doors 15 minutes ago. 15 minutes felt like a lifetime. Through the small window in the wall, Dan caught glimpses of blue scrubs moving urgently. One of the vets barked out terms he didn't recognize, something about internal bleeding, blood pressure dropping, fluid displacement. They'd said he had a chance, a small one. Dan closed his eyes and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped like he was praying. But it wasn't a prayer. Not really. He'd stopped doing that years ago. This was a plea, a silent demand to whatever was out there. Take anything else, just not him. Footsteps approached. Cole. He dropped down onto the bench beside Dan, silent at first. His face was lined with exhaustion and something deeper. Regret, maybe, or shame. He held a USB stick in one hand. Not the original drive, but a backup. "Feds took the captives into protection," he said. "Travis is with them. Witness security is fast-tracking his request. Said he gave them everything. Locations, names, internal ranks." Dan didn't respond. Cole looked toward the window. "How is he?" "Bad." Silence stretched. Then, quietly, Cole spoke again. "I turned myself in." Dan glanced sideways, brows knitting. Cole shrugged. "Part of the deal. Immunity for evidence. I get to testify. I lose my clearance, my pension, everything." Dan let out a dry breath. "You sure about that?" Cole nodded. "I made peace with it. This was never about me walking away clean. It was about making sure this ends." He handed Dan the USB. "This has everything we've collected. Names, routes, comms chatter. I also added the original command logs from Medellin, the ones they wiped." Dan's fingers curled around the drive. "You're in them," Cole added. "So am I. It proves everything." Dan looked down at the flash drive like it weighed 100 pounds. "You didn't owe me this." "No," Cole said, "but I owed him." They both looked at the window again. Scout was still on the table. Tubes, wires, oxygen mask. A monitor beeped steadily but faintly. A quiet heart, still beating. Hours passed. Dan hadn't moved. Eventually, a woman in surgical scrubs emerged from the double doors. Her face was unreadable, calm but worn. "Mr. Whitaker?" Dan stood instantly. "Yes." "He's alive." Dan's chest seized. The woman smiled gently. He's still very weak. We were able to stop the bleeding and stabilize him. The bullet fractured a rib and nicked a lung, but no major arteries. He'll need weeks, maybe longer, to fully recover, but he made it through surgery. Dan exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days. Can I see him? She nodded. Just for a few minutes. The recovery room was dim and quiet. Machines beeped softly. Scout lay wrapped in a blanket, his chest rising and falling slowly. A bandage wrapped across his ribs. His paw was connected to an IV. His breathing was labored, but steady. Dan pulled a chair beside him and sat, resting his hand on the dog's head. Still here, he whispered. You stubborn bastard. Scout's eyes fluttered open for a moment. Just long enough. Dan smiled. That's all I needed. He sat with him, not speaking anymore. He didn't need to. Everything they'd been through, every mile of forest, every burst of gunfire, every ghost they'd outrun, had led here, to this quiet room, to this heartbeat that hadn't stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old, chewed-up collar tag he'd kept since their first assignment, the one that had Scout's old number engraved in scratched silver. He placed it beside the fourth line. You brought me back to life once, Dan whispered. Now you're doing it again. The next morning, Dan stood outside the hospital, bathed in the soft morning sun. He handed the USB drive to a woman in a Navy suit, Agent Clara Jensen, Department of Justice Organized Crime Division. Her face was hard but not unfriendly. This is everything? She asked. Dan nodded. Every name, every connection. Redland Global doesn't get to vanish this time. Clara pocketed the drive. Cole's testimony lines up. Travis's too. You just helped us tear a hole through one of the largest private trafficking syndicates in the western U.S. Then finish the job, Dan said. No closed-door hearings, no quiet settlements. The public deserves to know who sold them out. Clara nodded. We'll make noise. She paused. You ever consider coming back? Dan looked toward the building. Not unless you deputize my dog. She smirked, then got into her car and drove off. Back inside, Dan returned to the room. Scout was still asleep, but his breathing sounded stronger now. More even. A nurse had left a handwritten note on the side table. VIPs get treats. Just say the word. There was a biscuit and a napkin beside it. Dan chuckled, then sat back down. The world outside could burn, rebuild, or reinvent itself however it wanted. But here, in this quiet little room, the only thing that mattered was the soft rhythm of paws twitching in dreams. A quiet heart, still beating, still fighting, still here. A year later, the wind sounded different. It moved softly through the pines surrounding a small farm just outside Sisters, Oregon, carrying with it the scent of earth, fresh hay, and something quieter. Peace. Dan Whitaker leaned on the porch railing of his one-story cabin, a coffee mug warm in his hands, watching as the sun crept over the treetops. He no longer woke to the sound of gunfire in his mind, or to memories that gripped his chest like a vice. These days he woke to paws on wooden floors. Inside, Scout was stirring, slowly, carefully, but with more strength than he'd had in months. The gray in his muzzle had spread, and he walked with a noticeable limp now, but his eyes were just as sharp, just as alive. Dan smiled when he heard the telltale thump of Scout's tail hitting the couch cushion. Still here, still fighting. Still the same dog who refused to quit, even when the world tried to take everything from him. Later that morning, Dan sat at the kitchen table with a stack of handwritten pages in front of him. His memoir, still unfinished. A title was scribbled at the top of the first page in pencil, Scout's Last Mission. He hadn't planned to write it, but after the trial, after the press conferences, the headlines, the national interviews, it became clear. People needed to know the truth. Not just about Redland Global, but about the quiet loyalty of those who'd fought the shadows and never asked for anything in return. A sharp bark pulled him from his thoughts. Dan looked up. Scout was by the front door, tail wagging softly, head tilted. Someone was coming. Dan stood and opened it. A delivery van was pulling away from the dirt road, a small package resting on the porch steps. No return address, just Dan's name, typed neatly on a label. He picked it up, stepped inside, and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in dark blue velvet, was a medal, a purple heart. Engraved on the back, K9 Scout. Service above. Self below it, a note. Your testimony changed everything. But Scout reminded us why we fight. Office of the Secretary of Defense. Dan held the medal in his hand for a long moment, then looked at Scout. I guess you outranked me now. Scout blinked slowly, then patted over, resting his head against Dan's leg. Dan knelt down and placed the medal beside the old worn collar tag that still hung near the fireplace. 2 tokens of a life lived in the space between war and healing. That afternoon, a knock came at the door. Emily Rowe stood outside holding a pie. You're still terrible at checking your messages, she said, smiling. Dan opened the door. That's part of the retirement package. She stepped in and looked toward the couch, where Scout lifted his head and gave a soft bark of recognition. Well, hey there, soldier, she said, crouching down to stroke his ears. Still stealing hearts? Scout licked her wrist in reply. They shared coffee and quiet conversation. Emily told stories from the clinic, rescued cats, impossible surgeries, a fox that refused to leave someone's barn. Dan listened, grateful for the normalcy, for the silence that wasn't haunted anymore. Before she left, she handed him a folded piece of paper. Just something I thought you'd want to see. He opened it. A letter from a 12-year-old girl named Ava, one of the rescued children from Site 12. In shaky handwriting it read, Dear Mr. Dan and Scout, thank you for saving us. I remember the dog the most. He was bleeding but still barking like he was telling us not to give up. My new family says he's a hero. I think he's more than that. He's hope. I hope he's happy now. Love. Ava Dan's throat tightened. He folded the letter carefully, placed it between the pages of his memoir draft, and sat in silence for a while. Then he walked outside with Scout, the sun dipping low behind the trees. They moved slowly along the worn dirt path behind the house, toward the edge of the woods. Dan sat on an old log. Scout rested his head on Dan's boots, and for a long time they watched the sky fade to gold. Later, as twilight settled in, Dan reached down and scratched behind Scout's ears. You know, he said quietly, I used to think my life ended the day I left the bureau. Or maybe the day I lost my family. But then you showed up, and everything changed. Scout lifted his head. Dan smiled. You weren't just my partner. You were the part of me that never gave up. The one that kept running toward the fire even when the world burned. He paused. Now look at us. Still here. The stars came out one by one. Scout's breathing slowed, steady and peaceful. Dan leaned back, arms behind his head, eyes on the sky. He didn't know what came next, but for once that was okay. Because for the first time in years, the war was over, and the dog was home. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.